Maximilian was his given name, but his family called him Maximus, after an old great-grandfather in Mexico who had once, when he was a young man, avoided a gunslinger's challenge by simply dropping his pants in the middle of the dirt street in the tiny town where he lived outside Lake Chapala. A well-to-do young lady in petticoats came out of the local hotel, saw great-granddad naked to the shins, and finding herself 10 feet away, said brightly to him in Spanish, "Oh, Carino, my darling, that's a Maximus appendage you have there." The name stuck, and within a year the two were married. They had 8 children and stayed together for more than 60 years. They were still alive when Maximus was born in 1965, and to hear his mother tell it, great-granddad had sauntered into her room after she gave birth, hobbling on his knobstick cane, and pulled Maximus's panal, his diaper, aside, took a peek, and said, "He'll do as a namesake."
JoAnneh, that was great. One take JoAnneh is what we're going to call you.
Thank you.
And what an opening. If that's not a grabber, I don't know what will be, okay? Folks, that was JoAnneh Nagler reading from her latest book, a collection of short stories titled Stay With Me, Wisconsin. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Lucchese, also known as Mark at the Mic, and JoAnneh Nagler is my guest today on Burlingame. It's a small town, sponsored by the Burlingame Historical Society. JoAnneh, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Mark.
JoAnneh, it's warm outside. I'm feeling good. I'm a little nervous, but I am pumped up. But before we get this thing on, this show on the road, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you?
Okay, so I'm a book author. I have written now 4 books and a 5th one on the way. 3 nonfiction books. One is called The Debt-Free Spending Plan. The next one is called How to Be an Artist Without Losing Your Mind, Your Shirt, or Your Creative Compass. And the last one is called Naked Marriage. And 2 of those were Amazon Top 100 books, I'm humbled and amazed to say.
Wow, very good, very good.
I'm also the producer, and I produced, wrote, and performed on 2 music CDs, one called I Burn and the other called Enraptured, both folk pop CDs. And my husband and I directed a play a couple years ago that I wrote called Ruby and George in Love at Sonoma Arts Live Theater Company. So generally all around artist and writer.
Boy, JoAnneh, that's quite a bio. I was expecting something like, well, I was valedictorian at my high school, and I wrote a couple of compositions.
Close, 3rd in my class.
Man. JoAnneh, I didn't hear anything about the college you went to.
That's because we went to the same school. We both went to Cal State Long Beach.
That's correct. Go Beach.
Go Beach.
So, JoAnneh, I read the 11 short stories in Stay With Me, Wisconsin, and I got to tell you, my only regret is the book ended. The stories were about love, loss, devotion, and desire. They really hit me too, man. The first 2 stories were right out of the gate, had me crying, okay? And so if you don't mind, and I'd like to read to our listeners one of the many great reviews you received.
Please.
And I quote, upon reading the last sentence of Stay With Me, Wisconsin, I lingered long, not ready to say goodbye to these wonderfully realized characters. They wound their way into my heart and thoughts, so much that long after I closed the book, I found myself wondering how they were faring in the world, as if they were people in my life. Now, that's a pretty darn good review. How does that make you feel?
Awesome. Amazing. I mean, this is the reason I do this. There's not a lot of glory. There's very little money. But the object when you sit down to do this is to move people, to make them feel something meaningful, to lift their heart in one way or another. Because fiction's all about how we fare in the world, right?
Yeah.
How we're human in the world, our blind spots, our elations, and the fact that touched that particular reviewer and several others is just the highest praise a writer can get.
Up to and including me, because I felt the same way. It was just wonderful.
It just moves me to no end, because that's why you do it.
Yeah. So the little teaser that you read at the opening of our podcast was from the story titled Maximus. Mm-hmm. What prompted you to choose that selection?
Well, I think it's a really good example of what I try to do in stories is get the reader right into the action. I have a couple of favorite writers, and one of the things I appreciate most about them is they don't wait for the reader. They jump right in, right? And so those little details, the setup, that by the end of the first paragraph, you're curious. And so I think that story has a really good opening. And, it's a great story. It's a story of immigrants who get a family of four who gets packed into the back of a Pontiac in 1975, driven across the border, and they're immigrants who come to San Francisco, and Maximus forms a very unlikely friendship with Herb Caen, the columnist.
I love that part. I love that story.
And it's, this is just stuff that came out of
Le Central restaurant.
Totally.
Yes. Yeah.
And this kid hangs out outside it, and they strike up this lifelong friendship. And so that story is really about love and family and finding your way in the world. So it really has great power for me.
Yeah, I can see that. It was just, I loved the book. I loved all 11 stories. And I want you to go ahead and tell a little bit about the book. There are 11 stories. I don't expect you to go through every one, but if you want to give us a few highlights and maybe talk a little bit about Ponte Bayswater and how you got that particular name, Bayswater.
Well, that's a great story for Burlingame. But I'll just tell you a little bit I'll give you a couple one-liners from the stories. One story is about a dog trainer in La Crosse, Wisconsin, who beds beautiful men, but she can't keep relationships together. Another about a male perfume editor who his lover treats him not very well, and he returns to Rhinelander for love. There's a pregnant farm girl at 15 in a little town called Omro. Obviously, Maximus smuggled across the border. Mount Everest climbing team photographer who is losing his moral compass and his marriage. Lake Geneva cop who has suffered a loss and finds love in the arms of a much older woman. And just out of college woman whose parents insist that she become an attorney like everybody else in the family, and she bucks her family's expectations, moves to a farm town, and falls in love with a barely of age cowboy.
Go ahead.
That's that.
How
did you
tie that all into Wisconsin?
When I write, I was born in California, and California feels like home to me, but we moved to Wisconsin when I was 10 to this little town, and my parents bought a little cafe. And so those were a lot of my formative years. And so when I write, the Midwest comes to me really brightly and really in a very sensual way. And so originally I thought, should I set it in California? Should I set it in Wisconsin? And I went back and forth a couple times. But the Wisconsin landscape was really, going from country to lake town to city was really varied. And some of my friends who live in Wisconsin have said, you really caught the texture of the Midwest, of that sort of what you see is what you get, friendly directness, and even the rhythm of the language. So that's also something I was trying to capture.
Yeah. So couple of words on Ponte Bayswater and how that came about.
So this is a good explanation of sort of how stories come to me. I was driving down California Drive, going by Bayswater, where you live.
Mark at the Mic lives on Bayswater with Kathy, you bet.
So how many times have I driven by there? A million times. I'm sitting at the stoplight. I'm thinking, who was Bayswater? This street probably got named somewhere around World War II. Maybe not, maybe earlier. But let's just say this guy went to the war, right? Who was he? And I thought, okay, he's got to end up in Wisconsin. Okay, his family came from Alabama. His father's name was really Brenowitz. He was half Jewish. His mother was an Alabama Bible Belt family, and they named the first name Pontius, right? This really unlikely name,
How you can have a name like
so
that.
So you know that kid got beat up. He just got beat up every day, in Alabama. And then when he goes to Green Bay, it gets worse. So he's 12 years old. He won't go outside and hang out with the kids. He hangs out with his old loopy Aunt Violet, who talks to him really directly about love and sex, right? Like, that's what I thought about at the stoplight. Yeah. And so it's an exercise.
So was this like a long stoplight, JoAnneh, or what?
Sometimes this stuff comes to me in like a 10-second flash.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
And the exercise is really to trust your imagination and trust your intuition, to not argue with it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's something that I've learned as a creative person, too. If I get the impulse, write a play, and I've never written a play, I no longer argue with the impulse. I just sit down and start to work on it and see what happens.
Yeah. I loved how you intertwined, I'm not sure if that's the correct word, but intertwined Mr. Bayswater, Ponte Bayswater throughout the book.
Well, that was an important element because every single story, the characters from one story show up in another story. So the stories feature one character or another, but they're all linked by family,
Yeah.
love, or friendship. And Ponty's the thread who goes through everybody's story.
Yeah, it was great. I didn't catch it at first, but it took me maybe 2 or 3, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's tying all these people in. It was really cool. Really
Thank
cool.
you.
Okay, so JoAnneh, it's now time for salt and pepper, whatever that means. It's my version of rapid fire questions.
Okay.
And we're going to drift from your book a little bit and just talk about writing in general.
Okay.
Why do people read fiction?
I really think fiction soothes the soul. You know, I'm a writer of nonfiction, but I don't read nonfiction. I read fiction because, you know, first of all, let's back up a minute. We're talking about literary fiction. There's fiction that's fantasy and mystery, and all of it takes you away one way or
Right.
another. But in literary fiction, what I'm writing, we're talking about how our hearts are moved in the world, what the paths that our lives take, the things that life throws in our path that we stumble over, and how do we pick ourselves up? How do we move with heart and love and meaning and in this case, devotion? How do we find those connections? So that's really what it's about for me. It's about heartfelt understanding.
Earlier, you mentioned that you have written 3 self-help books before Stay With Me, Wisconsin. What do you find compelling about writing fiction?
Well, the nonfiction books, the debt book, the art book, and the naked marriage book are all pretty much about how I fell down as an adult, you know, like all the skills you don't get taught. And so those books, I really write in a language of we. It's not me as an expert. It's here's how I fell down. Here's some tips I learned how to get up. Take what you like, leave the rest. The fiction for me is just like cream on my soul. The nonfiction books are like crafting a puzzle. The fiction books are like an exercise in trust. Just like I just described about you get an inspiration and emanation and just let it float, get out of the way, be the humble servant of the arc of the story.
Are you handwriting or using a word processor computer?
I definitely use a computer.
Yeah.
I mean, now, in fact, I tried to use voice technology a couple years ago.
No, didn't work.
No, because the impulses from my brain to my fingers are so ingrained, right, that it's part of the element of writing.
So how long have you been a writer, or when did you start to write?
I started writing poetry and brownies when I was 7. I wrote poetry all through high school, and I used to go on the speech team. I used to go compete in that category. But I didn't know I was a good writer until I was way into my 40s. In fact, it was a very funny story. We went to my high school reunion, one of my high school reunions, and there was a very smart kid named Alan who was in my class, and he pulled my husband aside and says, "What is she doing?" And my husband said, Mike said, "Well, she's writing books and she's writing articles." And he goes, "Oh, yeah, that fits. She was always really talented at that." And I came home and I was like, how come I didn't know that till I was 40? I never had that ambition when I was 20 that I was dying to be a writer.
Yeah.
It kind of evolved out of me.
At what point do you think someone should call themselves a writer?
Well, this is another good story. When Mike and I, when we were first together, lived in San Francisco. We had a little apartment on Nob Hill, and I used to take acting classes at ACT. And I started to audition for plays, and he said, "You need to call yourself an actor." And I said, "No, I can't. I have a day job, and I'm just starting." And he said, "Nope, you need to embody that role. And one day you'll find that you're in the room of being an actor, and you won't even have noticed that you walk through the hallway into that room."
Yeah.
Right? Which was fabulous advice. So instead of saying, "I work for nonprofits," I said, "I'm an actor, and I work for nonprofits to support."
You start believing that, don't you?
Well, you identify differently. You don't identify with your day job. You
Yep.
identify with what the things are that you're trying to get out in the world.
Yep.
So I started calling myself a writer probably in my late 30s, early 40s. And we won't say how long ago that was.
No, well, they say age is just a number, right?
Or your anniversary of your 29th birthday.
Yeah, correct. So, what's the difference now that you've written books?
Yeah.
What's the difference between a writer and an author?
That's kind of a blurry line, but if we say someone's a writer, it might mean that they're a journalist. It might mean that they write articles for newspapers or magazines or blogs. An author is usually someone who writes a book. But for those of us who write, we often go back and forth across that line. So it's a pretty blurry line these days.
Yeah. I'm going to go back and use Stay With Me, Wisconsin as an example for this next question. Mm-hmm. So what came first, the plot or the characters, and why? Especially when you're doing 11 different stories. I mean.
Right. So generally what happens, I have insights very early in the morning, and I keep little pieces of paper and pens. I have a nightstand that has 2 drawers, and I just keep pens and paper nearby because usually when I wake up in the morning, I'll have some kind of inspiration or sitting at a stoplight, and I keep a little notepad with me.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like when I made my music CDs. Like I would wake up in the middle of the morning and I'd hear 2 lines, and I might hear the lyrics and the music. Your golden laughter falls soft on me, and my heart's enraptured with yours tenderly. And I might hear that much in my head.
My goodness.
And I'll get up and pick up my phone and record that much, and then build the song around it. And so that's actually a really good example of how the stories happen. It's really very much the same. I'll just get a quick hit and say, well, I'll give you another example. The story Leaving Lefty is about a perfume editor for a big New York magazine, right, or New York newspaper. And my neighbor said, my friend's coming into town, he's a perfume editor. And I said, there is such a thing?
Yeah.
And that's where that story came from.
Yeah.
Just that much.
Yeah.
Who is this guy?
By the way, thank you for the singing the singing audition. Okay.
No problem.
So, do the words writer's block mean anything to you?
Well, my answer is probably not going to be popular for people who write because I don't have that in my world. I really just don't. If I sit down, it's there. But caveat to that is I wrote grant proposals for 20 years. And when you write grant proposals and you have deadlines, and let's say you have 12 grant proposals to deliver to your clients in 1 month, I have learned to, press up against my procrastination issues. Like usually when I was writing grant proposals and I didn't want to do it, I liked the writing, I hated the other stuff that went with it. So when I was doing that, I knew that I was going to spend 2 days scrubbing the bathtub and cleaning all the cupboards. And I just sort of had to build that procrastination time into my arc of when I needed to deliver. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Once I got going, I was fine. But now, so I wrote the first book. I was like, I had no desire to write a book about debt. It was a friend of mine who encouraged me to do it, right?
Yeah.
Because I had this little 5-minute-a-day plan. So what I did was I set the timer for an hour, and I wrote 1 hour a day by the timer, Monday through Thursday. And I said to myself, what else am I doing that's so, hell-bent important that I can't put aside 4 hours a week? And it was a crazy therapist, really, who said to me, because I went to him saying, what am I doing with my creative life? And he said, just do a little at a time, and over 6 months, you'll get a lot done.
Yeah, true.
So it's more important to me. I don't do 6 hours at a time and then not write for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It's more important to me to sit down and get regularity in short bits, and then the muses find you, and everything in your arena starts to come to you. As my husband says, don't hang out with a writer unless you want everything that happens to filter its way into a story.
That's good advice from Mike, see? So I know that you got several very good reviews for Stay With Me, Wisconsin. So how do you handle a negative book review?
Well, my first book, The Debt-Free Spending Plan, got picked up in the New York Times finance section, which, your first book, you get a review in the New York Times, a whole, half-page feature along with another book. It's huge, that doesn't happen right out of the gate very much. And he wrote all these great things, and then at the end, he went off on some tangent, some little missive thing that I wrote, and extrapolated way out of proportion, and I was really upset, and I talked to my agent. He said, well, I know the guy, you can write to him if you want. But then he said to me, just take the good parts, excerpt them, take the cachet, and leave the rest.
Yeah.
And so the reviewers are not the people you write for. I have a closet door that every time a reader emails me, and this happens a lot, and says, this How to Be an Artist book changed my life, or somebody emailed me and said, Stay With Me, Wisconsin made me think about things differently in a way that no other book has ever made me think about them. So you think about the themes, immigration, gay life, love, finding love, loss, devotion, how to find it, all those things. So the fact that somebody took the time to write me and tell me that's the stuff that moves me. That's who I write for. Or there's this great proverb, this great Jewish proverb that says, "She who saves one soul saves the whole world." And I really live by that. If I move one person, my job is done.
Yeah, true.
Because this is a humble arc, being a writer. It really
I can only
is.
Imagine, yes.
It's expensive and it's humble.
Yes. So you mentioned you have an agent, because I was going to ask you if you have an agent.
Yeah.
Is it hard to find an agent?
It is very challenging in this day and age, very, very challenging. In fact, I have worked with a couple people who have a business called the Book Doctors, and she said to me recently, for fiction, don't even bother with an agent. Go right to the small presses, because the big houses, and there's only 4 of them left, and the agents who pitch to them they just are not looking at the working author. They're looking for big and flashy. And you say, okay, well, you as an author, you have to just put some inquiries, some query letters, they call them, out to both small presses, agents, wherever you can. Now, I had an agent who then recently decided she didn't want to represent fiction anymore because she thinks it's too hard, right? So currently, I'm looking for a new one. I've had 2. Now I'm looking for a new one.
Is that the same way a book gets published with the agent? I mean, you're doing that yourself?
There's 3 ways to get your book published. So the first way is you pitch your book of short stories or your novel or your nonfiction book to an agent, and then they take it to the 4 big publishers, and then there's about probably 30 to 40 second level, or what we call boutique agencies or boutique publishers that you can...
The big guys are Random and...
you got it.
Yeah.
All HarperCollins,
Yes.
etc., W.W. Norton. So you can do that the traditional way. You can go to a small press, which there are tons of them, hundreds and hundreds of them, and then you mostly don't need an agent for those. And they do a lot of fiction, poetry, they'll do nonfiction memoir, or you can self-publish, which is you can just publish it yourself.
When you go to publish your book, and when it's published, how many books come out? How many books in the first edition?
It depends on whether or not it's coming from a traditional source like a small press or a big publisher. If it's self-published, it usually goes print on demand, which is it's digital. You order it, it gets printed and sent to you. And so a lot of the small presses are going to that format just because they don't have to have an outlay of cash.
So it would be like 100 copies, though, or something like that? Or
if you printed
10
it,
copies, yeah.
If you printed it, probably be about 100 to start, and then you see.
With the hopes of selling them all out. What happens if you don't, over a specific period of time, maybe the books haven't gone away or sold, or what happens?
The publisher will pay a little storage fee, and it can sit on the distributor's shelf forever and ever. If it's print on demand, it doesn't matter because it comes out one at a time. And if the publisher has sent it out to bookstores, the bookstores have the right to, it's called returns or remainders. And so that's reflected in my royalty statement.
Got it. And the jacket design for the book, where does that come from? Yeah,
that's a really good topic. I have lucked out on that count. I've had really beautiful covers. Usually the publisher will have a designer, and I like to work directly with the designer because I usually have pretty strong artistic ideas because I paint.
Yep.
Stay With Me, Wisconsin the cover was the brainchild of our publisher, and she did a beautiful job. And then she and I worked together on the spine and the back cover.
Yeah, it's a great jacket, great cover. I mean, it's eye-catching, and I think you want a jacket to be eye-catching.
Well, there's also something else these days, something that you wouldn't think about. You want it to be visible on small screens.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
So you want the letters to stand out when people look at it on their phone.
Who is your favorite author?
Now we get into the good stuff. So my favorite author is Laurie Colwin. And the reason I really love her is because her characters are really quirky.
What was the last name?
Colwin, Colwin.
Okay.
She died in 1992, somewhere around the age of 40.
Geez.
She wrote about 5 novels and 2 books of short stories. And she does what I aspire to. She gets you right in. right? She'll say,
Yep.
you know, Guido's the name of one of her characters who runs a foundation in New York City, and he hires this guy to be his administrative assistant. The guy's tall and lean with a shock of black hair, takes black beauty speed pills, and types 90 miles a minute, right? So you totally, in that sentence, get a complete picture of who that guy is, right? And I'm a big believer in that because I'm about the emotional arc. I like the emotional arc of the story. So the setting notes, where we are, the character notes, the descriptions, I want them fast and quick and simple but vivid, but I don't want to take 2 pages talking about the dew on the grass.
Yeah, right.
But there are beautiful books I've read that do that.
As
it's
would
just
be
not
in a
my
novel. As would be in a novel.
Yeah,
right?
but that's just not my style.
Right.
But that's what I love about Laurie Cohen. It's kind of the same thing as, I'm a big fan of Aaron Sorkin. I've watched The West Wing, we watched it 10 times through, easy. And he doesn't wait for the audience to catch up. He drops you in a set of circumstances, and the stakes are already there right when it begins. And that's what I aspire to.
What book are you currently reading?
I actually am reading and editing a book that's not out yet. It's called A Sheltering Place by Kevin Callahan, which he has a book of poetry called Roadmap out from my same publisher. And it's lovely. It's all short vignettes of living and growing up in Iowa, and it's just lovely. And then the other book I'm rereading Paula McLean's Circling the Sun, which is all about Beryl Markham, and I love it.
So you'll reread a book?
Oh, yeah. The Yonah Lassie Writing Camp for Girls.
That's amazing.
I'll reread that over and over because sometimes I'm also looking as a writer from the perspective of, is this person writing from I did this, I did that, or is the author saying she did this, she did that? So I'm looking at their technique as well. But there's certain books that I just want to go back to over and over again.
I like to rewatch movies, but I find it hard to reread a book because it takes me so long. Anyway, that's kind of why I like the short story thing. Yeah. And that's why I enjoyed your book so much.
I'm so glad.
Because I could read it, in an hour. I mean, I could read a story in an hour or so and then get to the next one and wouldn't lose context. But
let me ask you a question about that, because one of the things that I've been accused of is tying my stories up in too many bows at the end. Like some of my writer friends, and I'm in a writers group, will say, everything. And Michael says this too, my husband. You like things tied up in a bow, but I really like there's a lot of short stories today that are abstract, right? They're kind of ambiguous. They leave things hanging. But if I'm going to take you on a journey for 20 pages, I want you to walk away feeling like you know what you took away, right? You got an awareness, an awakening, a feeling. So I like that because, life doesn't serve up that a lot.
well, whatever you did right.
Thank you.
It struck me it struck me well. So, JoAnneh, in interest of time,
yes,
I'm going to give you a little opportunity to plug your latest novel that hasn't come out yet, Key West.
Fabulous.
You can take a minute or two for that, and then I'll probably have another question or two, and we'll wrap things up. So go ahead with Key West.
So Key West is a story of a young woman in 1979 who feels trapped in her little upper Michigan town, Marquette, Michigan. Her sister, her younger 16-year-old sister, is pregnant, and the boyfriend has taken off and gone off to work in an old Milwaukee brewery, and the parents are upset. The father's a doctor who's lost his shirt investing. And so it's what happens to her. She's a musician. Her dad wants her to be a nurse. And she finally, when there's an event that happens with her sister, she ends up leaving and going to Key West. And it's what happens to her in her romantic life, in her musical life, as these two ends of her life, this cold, cold, small town, provincial, gossipy, and this other place where it's bohemian and open and lush and warm. And it's what happens to her as she has to create and invent her life and choose between these things. There's a what happened later in the book. I won't give it away.
Yeah.
But I had a beautiful time writing that book. I enjoyed every minute of it.
When do you think it'll be released?
I do not know. I'm taking it out to agents and editors at small presses right now.
Great.
As I said, I'm in a writers group, so I bring stuff to that writers group monthly, and we every other week meet and go over it. So it's pretty polished now.
Good. Maybe you can send a copy over?
Sure. You want to read it?
Why not?
Okay. I'd love your commentary.
Yeah. I have one last question before we wrap it up.
Okay.
This is a question that kind of like my hero, my interview hero, James Lipton of the Actors Workshop.
Oh, yeah.
He had 10 or 12 questions he would always ask people, but he always concluded with one question that I really liked, and it was, and he was an atheist, but he would come up with it. He always asked this one question: if heaven exists, what would you like God to hear? What would you like God to say to you when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You showed up. You left it all on the field. You listened to every creative impulse. You fulfilled what you came here to do.
Did my wife call you and tell you that was the question I was going to ask
No.
you? No? Well, JoAnneh, that was a great answer. And, in interest of time and everything, I always promised the Historical Society we would wrap this up in around 30 minutes, and we're pretty darn close to that. So, JoAnneh Nagler, thank you so much for joining us today on Burlingame. It's a small town.
It was just a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thanks for interviewing me.
I'd like to thank JoAnneh Nagler for being our guest today on Burlingame. It's a small town. Her book, Stay With Me, Wisconsin, is now available at the Burlingame Library and, of course, on Amazon and all other paperback and EPUB versions. We just heard that one of the stories in her book has been nominated for the prestigious Pushcart Prize for Fiction. Way to go, JoAnneh. Thanks to my videographer, the great Ray Tyler, Kathy and Shelby for editing and producing, and our musical director, Bray. You can hear more of Bray at bray.com. Finally, thanks to the Burlingame Public Library for allowing me to use Conference Room A as my adopted recording studio. The Burlingame Historical Society copyrights this video podcast, and no part of this program can be rebroadcast or copied without permission. So until next time, everyone, see you around Burlingame. It's a small town.